Hello and welcome to the course Basics of Experimental Design for Cognitive Psychology. I am Dr. Ark Verma from the Department of Cognitive Science at IIT Kanpur. This is week 4 of the course where we are talking about experimental designs, and we are basically discussing elements of an experiment, basically what are the things that go when you are setting up an experiment, and we are basically discussing that. If you remember, in the previous lecture we talked about the general considerations that play a very important part when an experimenter has to decide which task to choose for answering the research question, for testing the hypothesis and so on. We also talked about the tasks typically used, and we discussed in detail the free description and the rating scale kinds of tasks. All right. So, in the current lecture what we will do is we will extend the same discussion and we will talk about two different kinds of tasks, which are the forced choice task and the special multiple choice task in some detail. Okay, I am not going into extreme details and all the nitty-gritties of these tasks, but I am giving you an overview of what are the things necessary or what kind of tasks are used for forced choice or special forced choice tasks. Now, the forced choice tasks are basically ones that measure limited number of basically a participant's response in terms of a limited number of potential answers from the participants about a given stimulus. Okay. So, remember we are talking about rating scale where you had to within a particular bounded range from 1 to 5 basically choose either 1 or 5 for the stimuli. So, which of the stimuli is more symmetric or beautiful and so on. In forced choice tasks, there is a limited number of options. So, it constrains the kinds of responses that the respondent or the participant can actually give. All right. Again, these are still about the relevant dimensions of the stimulus which the participant has to respond, but within a given range. So, that is basically why it is called a forced choice task. The choice is forced, it is constrained. All right. So, it is broadly at its core a discrimination task, because it shows how well the participants can perceive a specific difference between the stimuli at hand. So, it could be 2 stimuli, 5 stimuli, 10 stimuli, but the idea is that we expect the participants to distinguish between stimuli, discriminate between stimuli along a particular specific dimension of interest. Say for example, which of these 3 pictures is more symmetric, or which of the 2 letter strings are a word or a non-word, something like that. Now, if constructed carefully, if you pay a lot of attention, if you construct these carefully, this task can also be used to measure recognition times and accuracy, recognition performance, or sometimes even full psychometric functions. All right. So, going forward, in a forced choice task, participants are required to choose from a limited number of explicitly listed alternatives. The alternatives typically describe some aspect of the stimuli, such as color. So, which of the 2 is brighter in color, something like that, which of the 2 shapes presented is a rectangle or a triangle, location, painting style, anything that you want to ask, but you have to basically give a limited number of options about a relevant dimension of the stimulus about which the participant decides. All right. Now, the alternatives are almost always mutually exclusive. So, this is something which is important in this forced choice task, that if one alternative is true, typically the others cannot be. Say for example, if you are given a letter string and you have been asked to decide in a lexical decision task which of the 2 is a word. Now, the thing is, if you say that this particular stimulus is a word, then this stimulus cannot be a non-word. All right. Or if, say for example, which of the 2 stimulus is symmetric or not symmetric, or even one stimulus, let us not talk about comparison, given stimulus, tell whether this stimulus is symmetric or not symmetric. Now, you have a stimulus, you have 2 options, symmetric, not symmetric. If you choose symmetric, then obviously it is not symmetric. If you choose not symmetric, then obviously you cannot come back and say no, it was symmetric. Okay. So, the options are listed and constrained, and these options are mutually exclusive, they are mutually not possible at the same time. Also, these options are mutually exhaustive. What does that mean? It basically covers all other possible options. All right. So, once you cover this, it basically covers all the other dimensions, the other one is not even going to be considered. And these are specifically tailored to the experiment, and therefore, they require prior knowledge about the expected results. All right. So, we will see some examples as we go ahead. We will discuss some of the forced choice tasks that are available and that are used widely by experimental researchers in psychology. Now, forced choice tasks can be designed to either give a qualitative or a quantitative measurement of about how distinct or discriminable several stimuli are from each other. Okay. So, you can have say for example 2 or 5 or 10 different stimuli, and you can basically ask participants to discriminate between them. You can basically sometimes ask for a qualitative judgment, say for example which of the stimuli presented here are more aesthetically pleasing and so on, or you can just ask on a single dimension, just like I was saying, symmetric, asymmetric, word, non-word, tool, non-tool, object, anything like that. Okay. The results range from a simple threshold that, say for example, which of the two came first. So, if you are doing let us say a temporal order judgment task, you can ask which of the two stimuli flashed first on the screen. So, you can basically get a simple threshold, how much of a change is needed for you to be able to distinguish the two stimuli from each other, or sometimes just detection, and both of these can be plotted on a full psychometric function, and this is basically why these tasks are very popularly used. The 4 choice tasks are very popularly used in psychophysics and experimental psychology experiments. Some of the typical questions that you can ask using these 4 choice tasks are, I am just going to tell them, but you will see that broadly these questions are on the qualitative side, but you can also have quantitative questions asked as well. Now, for example, which style of paintings do people prefer, this one or that one, something like that, or how easy are the following expressions to recognize, hard or easy, something like. So, you will give a list of choices 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1 and 2, or say for example 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, but you are basically asking the participant to make a decision along a particular dimension of your stimulus. Now, let us look at some of the variants of the forced choice task. All right. Now, one of the very popular ones is the n alternative forced choice task. Here, as the name suggests, n alternatives are given, not 2, not 3, not 4, any number can be given. Okay. Not necessarily 2 or 3 or 4, but you can actually have a large number of choices as well. Now, n alternatives are given and the participant must choose one of them for each stimulus. Okay. The participant is free to choose the same alternative for different stimuli as well. Say for example, in a lexical decision task, there are only 2 choices, word and non-word, and there are let us say 500 stimuli. So, obviously, some of them will be for a lot of them word option will be chosen, for a lot of them non-word option will be chosen. So, across different stimuli, you can choose the same option for different stimuli as well. Although the stimuli are selected such that each alternative will be chosen equally often, it is not really a requirement. Typically, when you are doing forced choice task, you try and make sure that both options occur relatively equally. So, for example, if there is 2 alternative forced choice tasks, word, non-word, symmetric, non-symmetric and so on, you will try and arrange your stimulus presentation as such that they will be let us say 50% of the time it will be word, 50% of the time it will be non-word, but it is not really a requirement. You can actually have filler words as well and other things, other options emerging as well. All right. Now, the alternatives might be sometimes absolute descriptions. So, look at the face and tell whether it is a happy or a sad, or it can be related to some standard, say for example, faster than this, slower than this, earlier than this, later than this, something like that. Okay. Now, in a special variant of this task, multiple stimuli can be shown simultaneously and the participant would be required to pick one of them. So, there are also tasks where people are asked to make a choice. Say for example, among the 5 faces present here, which of the faces is the happiest. So, participant sort of moves their cursor, cursor on the screen and selects one and says this one seems to be the happiest. Now, there are other smaller variations of this. The main one was this an alternative forced choice task, but there are other variations of this as well. For example, n plus 1 alternative forced choice task is basically the same as the previous one, but there is one more alternative here where you can basically you refuse to make a choice. So, which of the two is faster, A, B, neither, something like that. All right. Now, there is n plus n interval forced choice task. Now, interval forced choice tasks are a special variant of the forced choice task where n stimuli are shown sequentially. So, 2, 3, 4, n is that number, and the participants are required to choose one interval based criterion. For example, which of the following 2 stimuli is the happiest, or which of the following 3 stimuli is the fastest. So, you basically are in some sense saying that okay, this one is the reference, then is this the fastest, is that, and this is the choice is based not on absolute values, but on intervals. So, that is the idea. Again, the n+1 interval non-forced choice task is just a variation of this one, where you also have, where you basically have an option to refuse making a choice. Say one alternative might be none of the above. You know, in MCQs we use this a lot, choose A, B, C, D, or E will be none of the above, something like that. Now, let us sort of attend to you know, the details of this task as well. For example, you are an experimenter and you pose this question to a participant: do you like this painting or not? Now, this question would require the participant to make a specific forced choice. For instance, the participant wants to say, I like this painting. Now, the second response becomes mutually exclusive already with the first response. You cannot say I do not like this painting and I like this painting for the same painting. All right. So, this basically becomes an example of the simple two alternative forced choice task, or the two AFC task, versions of which are widely used in a lot of experimental and cognitive psychology experiments. Okay. Now, there are a couple of points that I would like us to sort of pay attention here. So, I will just talk about them. For example, there are two alternatives here and the participant must choose one and only one of them for the stimulus. So, that is an absolute necessity, and this is basically why you know, it is very amenable. For example, when you want to measure reaction time or accuracy. So, you want to basically give 500 words and ask people to make the judgments about which of the two is a word or a non-word, or which of these or whether the presented stimuli is a word or a non-word, or the presented stimuli is a face or a non-face, is a happy expression, sad expression. You can do a bunch of these things, and the dependent variable, a very likely dependent variable, could be reaction time or accuracy, but also qualitative measurements can also be taken. You can basically ask, why do you like this painting, and you can have follow-ups and so on. Now, as there is a single painting in consideration for the most part in this 2FC task, the results provide information solely about this painting. Now, the problem here is, if the experimenter asks several people the same question about this painting, then you will start to get some idea about this specific painting, because you are presenting one stimulus and you are asking about this. So, they would be you know, it will help you average out what typically people feel about this painting. Do a lot of people like this painting? Is the average likability of this painting, let us say on a scale of 1 to 5, above 5, you know, above 3 or below 3, and something like that. All right. Now, if the experimenters were to add more paintings and ask the participants to decide for each painting whether or not they like it, the task itself will not really change, but the type of information that you can obtain can diverge. So, you can basically have more participants, single stimuli, you can have more stimuli as well as more participants as well, and it depends on what is it that you are seeking from the task. You can sometimes ask to make comparative decisions also. You can just basically try and summate, or say for example collate the decision of different participants about this single painting as well. Okay. So, these two kinds of information can be gotten from this task, obtained from this task. Third is, I am sure this is already clear from the first point, is that the second alternative is the pure negation of the first. So, the two alternatives are mutually exclusive. It is not possible for both to be true at the same time. If you do not like this painting, you do not like this painting. If you cannot say, oh, I like this painting as well. If this is if a given letter string is a word, then it is a word, it is not a non-word. All right. So, these two things are mutually exclusive, and this is typically how these tasks are structured. Also, the task provides two alternatives. Since the task provides two alternatives for a single stimulus, an experiment could just as easily use the stimuli as the alternatives and provide a single category. For example, you could show two paintings and ask them, which do you like more, the first one or the second one, the earlier one or the later one, and in that sense the first one can act as a baseline for the other one, or the second one can act as a baseline for the previous one, and you can make these comparisons. So, given that you are comparing these stimuli and you have given two options, you can play with these kinds of you know things as well. Another interesting thing is that it is broadly a discrimination task. Okay. So, if the research question deals with whether people can discriminate between two stimuli, the clearest way would be to show the stimuli either sequentially, you show one and then you show the other, or you show both of them together and ask them to choose one of them based on the relative dimension. So, which of the two is more symmetrical, or say for example, you present one first and then the second one and say whether this is more symmetrical than the previous one or not. If the results are tied, then it can be concluded that the participants are not able to discriminate between the two. Hence, you have to probably play with the variable a little bit more, maybe make the difference larger, so that the participant can detect whether one is more symmetrical than the other. Now, there are some general guidelines which we can keep in mind when we are designing these tasks, and I am just mentioning because the two alternative force choice task is something that a lot of experimenters use. So, first is keeping non-mutually exhaustive alternatives. For example, the alternatives do not necessarily have to be mutually exhaustive. There is, however, a very real chance that the results, if you do not create non-mutually exhaustive alternatives, then your results might be less clear. For example, if the alternatives are not mutually exhaustive, let us say you are presenting a facial expression and asking if it is a happy or sad, in the two alternative force choice tasks. As long as the expressions are more towards the happy side or more towards the sad side, the discrimination can be made and you can make this decision. However, and till that point the participant will be able to perform the task. But say for example, you are presenting an expression that is pleasantly surprised. So, your stimulus have to be in such a way, if you are presenting pleasantly surprised, then the interpretation of results will become less clearer, because either the participant will chalk it towards more happy, or sometimes by mistake chalk it towards more sad, and that will create a bit of ambiguity about what the participants are actually doing. So, when you are presenting these alternatives, when you are presenting the stimulus, it is extremely important that the stimuli are sort of in some sense very different on the relevant dimension. Also, asymmetry in the kind of responses that are presented. So, participants usually assume that alternatives will occur equally often. So, as I said, in a lexical decision task, typically what you would assume is that 50% of the time non-words will come and 50% of the time words will come, and the order shall be randomized. Okay. Now, if one of the alternatives does not appear in the stimulus set at all, participants will still choose it on some trials simply because they think that, oh, it must be there as well. Some words might be non-words as well. Suppose you are presenting 500 words, all 500 of them are words. Then sometimes what might happen, if the participant is not very sure, let us say they are not very proficient in the language of testing, they might start indicating some of the actual words as non-words as well, because they think, okay, it is a word non-word decision task, and the question that is being asked is this a word? Must be that some of these stimuli that are being presented to us are non-words as well, and maybe I am not able to detect it. So, I will make these choice on some of the trials at least. All right. So, as the frequency with which the different alternatives occur in the stimulus set, and as this frequency changes, some participants will try and guess the relative frequency of this in the stimulus set. Isliye one of the reasons that is done is that you use typically randomized distribution of these stimuli. So, across trials you randomize the presentation and randomize the frequency. In some sense, frequency is broadly said, the best one is 50-50, but in some tasks you will see that people used 70% and 30% and 30%. So, people sort of also have manipulated the probability of presenting the two different kinds of stimuli, and sometimes that becomes a critical dimension. How are people with being able to recognize that given dimension or not? So, if that is relevant to your research question, obviously do that. Otherwise, it is always a good idea to take care of this asymmetry a little bit. Order of presentation. So, another important issue that is closely related to this asymmetry between choices is also the order of the correct answers. Now, it has been shown that participants have a very clear expectation about random distributions and are willing to accept short sequences of identical stimuli, but not long. As I was telling, if you presented a lexical decision task, there are 500 words to be presented. If there are 500 words to be presented, your participant will basically expect that around half of them will be words, half of them will be non-words, and something like that. Now, the thing is, if the participant is making the same choice, if the stimuli are coming like that, you present a word, then another word, then another word, then another word, and so on. So, if it goes on for 3 trials, maybe 5 trials, maybe even 10 trials, the participant might still say, okay, this is fine. But say for example, if it is a long sequence, you present all the words, let us say 40 of them in the same sequence, and then the non-words start appearing, then the participant will sort of start having concerns about what is happening here, and they might basically become start responding erratically on the task, and that sort of disturbs the overall the kind of responses you get and the analysis of the task as well. So, the alternatives in the 2 AFC task must be presented in a manner that both options occur symmetrically and broadly in a random order. All right. Now, another interesting thing when you create these 2 alternatives for this forced choice task is basically this issue related to category level. Okay. So, the experimenters could present, say for example, several pictures of animals and ask participants to indicate if the animal, let us say, is a dog or a Siamese cat. Now, the thing is, dog is a general level category, say for example, animal, mammal, dog and so on. Siamese cat is a very specific subcategory within the cat. Now, if you create options like this, where the options are, one is at a particular level of hierarchical organization and the other is at a particular other level, then this kind of comparison becomes tricky and it basically creates problems for the participants to respond. So, the idea is, whenever you are creating 2 options, it is always a good idea to keep the 2 options at the same semantic level or at the same hierarchical level of organization, so that the participants can actually make a better decision. It does not become a problem for them, because typically dog and Siamese cat, they will not be able to compare. Also, chance level. So, for example, any forced choice task, typically we are saying 2 alternative forced choice tasks. Now, in a 2 alternative forced choice task, what is the performance going to be? There is something called as a chance level. Say for example, 50%, given that there are 500 word stimuli, 50% of them are words, 50% of them are non-words. If you are checking for them, there is something like a chance level, which is basically the percent at which the participant is going to choose any of the given alternative. So, chance basically reflects the percent of which percent of the time that a given alternative would be chosen if the participant had no knowledge of the alternatives or the stimuli and basically we are choosing the alternatives blindly. See, it is a 2 alternative task, either a word is there, either a non-word is there. So, even if I am blindly sort of saying some of the trials I will say word, some of the trials I will say non-word, and I will sort of get through the task nicely. Basically, what is happening here is that if my performance is at chance level, it basically reflects that I do not know and I am not evaluating the critical dimension of the stimuli, that is the meaning part of the lexical status part of it. So, chance level performances are typically frowned upon and you do not try and include them in your data analysis, because in 2 AFC tasks this is around 50%. So, that is extremely low accuracy and it basically is not enough information to tell you that the participants were actually making decision based on the critical dimension that you have manipulated in your stimuli. So, that is why in most 2 AFC tasks you will see that chance level participants that have performed at chance level are actually excluded from the data analysis. There is a slight sort of a theoretical point here, that whether it is an identification task or a discrimination task. Now, a lot of times people incorrectly assume that these 2 AFC tasks are identification tasks. For example, if the experimenters are showing a series of expression to the participants and they are asking them to choose a name for each one of the, let us say, 10 possible alternatives, and if the participants are able to choose the correct name, you would say that they identified the expression. That is all right, but it is also possible that the choice was made not on the basis of identification, but by discrimination between other different alternatives. All right. So, that is one of the reason why broadly it has to be considered as a discrimination task, because what you are doing is, let us say, coming back to this lexical decision example, word, non-word. Now, some stimuli, it is possible that the participants are regarding some stimuli as words, because they are sufficiently different just on the statistical properties from the things that he or she has earlier regarded as non-words. Okay. It is not necessary that the participant knows the meaning of this word and is basically making the judgment based on that aspect, but is just making this discrimination between non-word stimuli and word stimuli, and on the basis of that making these further decisions. So, one of the things that has to be considered is that whether this 2 AFC task is a identification or a discrimination task, and typically it seems that it has to be treated as a discrimination task. Last 2 points. So, clarity of alternatives. Obviously, experimenters are encouraged to present the alternatives in clear and ambiguous terms, so that the participants can actually understand what are the two options. So, for example, when you are doing, let us say, a lexical decision task, and you are basically asking your participants to make these decisions, you would want to be sure that the participants understand what a word is and what a non-word is. What is say for example, if you are telling something this is symmetrical, choose between symmetrical and unsymmetrical response, you have to tell what do you mean by symmetry. You will have to say, for example, vertical symmetry, vertical mirror symmetry, something you will have to describe and show the participants. That is why it is always a good idea to have some practice trials, to have some pilots where you are sort of sure that the participants are actually understanding what is going on. Okay. Also, uncertainty, because a forced choice task does not actually measure any physical property, it basically measures a participant's judgment or belief, and thus the participant's response typically includes a bit of a measure of uncertainty as well, which, by the way, if you see nowadays, people are sort of very conscious of this, and some of the data analysis maneuvers are actually accounting for this uncertainty, but we will talk about this at some later point. Okay. Now, two alternative forced choice tasks, this is what we have been discussing. There are two, typically this task has been used in psychophysics and experimental psychology. It is very useful in determining, say for example, distinguishing between stimuli, sometimes on the basis of what is called an absolute threshold, sometimes on the basis of what is called a difference threshold. For example, what is the absolute threshold? I will talk about this when we are talking about psychophysical experiments. Absolute threshold is the minimal amount of dimension that is needed for people to be able to detect that dimension. Okay. So, imagine you are sort of turning the knob of a music system. The point at which the music becomes barely audible, detectable to the participant, is that absolute threshold, and there are psychometric functions that you can plot with this, and you can basically do this across the dimension several times with the same participant, and then also across participants to determine. Typically this is done with the same participant to determine the absolute threshold for a given stimulus on a given dimension for a particular participant. Okay. The other kind of decision that these tasks are used for is for determining the difference threshold. What is the difference threshold? It is basically also referred to as the just noticeable difference. So, here basically what you have is you have two stimuli, and you basically want to vary the stimuli along a dimension, so that they can just notice a change. Sometimes you can do this with a single stimulus also. You are changing the contrast. So, and you ask the question whether the stimulus is the same as before or not. So, the point at which along a dimension the stimuli begins to change, and that change is detectable. Okay. So, JNDs are measured by typically asking participants to discriminate between two stimuli along the same dimension, which of the two is heavier, which of the two is brighter, more symmetric, and you can sort of have a number of questions with that. Now, there are obviously two primary requirements of the two AFC tasks that are selected. Firstly, that the two alternatives cannot be simultaneously true, we have talked about this, and secondly, they need to cover the manipulated space as well. So, let us say what is the option space in a lexical decision task? Word, non-word. So, obviously jointly they should exhaust, there should not be a third option available for the stimuli, that is the idea. And this is a very useful task. It has been used to measure a wide variety of things depending on the categories chosen, the questions asked, the stimuli used, the manner in which the stimuli are presented, and so on. So, also different kinds of participant populations as well. So, this is something of a very important version of the forced choice task that the experimenters in psychophysics people have used in great detail. Now, I will briefly just touch upon the specialized multiple choice task as well. Now, in essence, the multiple choice tasks are still basically discrimination tasks, which basically measure how well a difference can be perceived among several stimuli, again on the same, on a specific dimension. And these type of tasks are just derivatives of the forced choice task. and were designed to address slightly special questions, but they have been become standardized techniques now, and people use them a lot. For example, what kind of questions do we ask? How long do specific higher cognitive processes take? How well can people search for a specific target given noise? How well and quickly can people learn and respond with a new rule? How does the perceptual system select what gets further processing or not? Things like that. So, these kinds of questions can broadly be addressed, and this is obviously not exhaustive list, but this can be broadly addressed within the special multiple choice tasks. Just discuss a few variants. For example, the go no go task, it is very popular task in terms of measuring executive functions, inhibitions and so on. So, this if the stimuli presented meet certain criteria, so you can ask the participant to that if the stimuli presented meet certain criteria, you press the button. If it does not, you do not press the button. Say for example, if the stimulus presented is I don't know, is a symmetrical shape, press the key. If it is not symmetrical, don't press the key. You can have a go no go kind of task like that. There are also a lot of versions of this go no go task presented in language switching research, task switching research and so on. There is also a match to sample task, is a slight variation on this. Here basically what you do is you present a standard stimulus, and the standard stimulus is then presented with another stimuli which is called the comparison stimulus, and you compare the standard and the comparison stimulus on a particular dimension, and the participant is typically asked to choose the comparison stimulus that most closely matches the sample. Okay. So, I remember we did this figure matching task in one of our experiments. Basically what you do is you start with the reaction time experiment, you basically have blank screen, fixation cross, figure presented at the center, then two figures, there is this arrow on the middle and there is a figure on the left and the right side. The task of the participant is to check which of the figures matches the previous one. Alright, it's just a simple figure matching task. It is asking the people to sort of broadly match the two shapes, and what we are measuring is reaction time and accuracy, but this is also an example of what you call a match to sample task. Another very popular task in cognitive psychology research, especially with attention researchers, is the visual search task. Here typically a specific target, let us say a letter T, can be presented simultaneously with a series of other items which are called distractors, because they are making the job of finding this T more difficult. These distractors are generally similar to the target along some dimension of interest. Say for example, you can have participants searching for a T between a visual space that has lots of L's and I's, and because L, I and T are very similar to each other, it sort of makes finding the T slightly more difficult. Now again, this variation between the target and distractor is systematic, so that you know exactly what is making searching for this difficult or easy. Okay. So experimenters also, by the way, they can vary the number of distractors across trials systematically, and the participant is required to indicate whether the target was present among the distractors or not. Typically what you are measuring here is how much the addition of the target increases the amount of time it takes to find the target. So, reaction times, accuracy, etc., are very typical dependent measures for this kind of task. Also, there is this rapid serial visual presentation task, which is very common for a lot of experiments. For example, the attentional blink experiment and some others. It basically involves presenting a large number of stimuli across very rapid sequence. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, say for example, a typical attentional blink task, around 15-16 stimuli come very fast, rapidly followed by each other with a they are each presented for typically around 70 to 80 milliseconds. The intertrial interval is around 15-20 milliseconds. One comes and the other comes and the other comes and so on, and you see a series of stimuli, among which you have been told that you look for, let us say, a black colored O or a white colored X, and these become your targets in this rapid serial visual presentation, which the participant has to decide. And typically what the experimenters are looking for is either reaction time or accuracy for detecting a given target in this rapid serial visual presentation of stimuli. Okay. So, this technique is being utilized in the general go no go task as well as the attentional blink tasks. So, I think this was a broad sort of an overview of the kinds of tasks we are using. Obviously, this is neither an exhaustive list, a complete list, or I have not even touched upon all the factors, but I just wanted to give you an overview of the kind of experimental tasks that are available and how they are used to address specific research questions and test different kinds of hypotheses. I will continue this discussion on the elements of an experiment in the next lecture as well. Thank you.